Matthew Lyon talking about, or Matt Lee is I prefer his nickname as he introduced himself, talking about music and ideas with programming. So take it away, sir.
Yeah, actually, this is going to be more of a music theory talk with code that is examples. The code that I'm going to show here it's basically a JavaScript app. It's up on GitHub here. You can download it and run it with just npm. Pretty straightforward. And there's a little app with an outline, and I've got kind of a README with some links in here, and I'm going to go through this and I talk about music theory, which is really it's music theory is this sort of like big nebulous thing, and it is less of like a prescription on how to write music as it's often sold as, and more of an attempt to understand how music works or what works in music. A lot of times across a broad spectrum of music and not like individual pieces. People will do music theory analysis of everything from Mozart to Radiohead to Lady Gaga, or actually the most recent one that I saw that was actually kind of interesting was on Childish Gambino's "This Is America." He's got some interesting chords in there, but it is more of a attempt to explain why something works or has the effect it has, and less a prescriptive attempt at saying, well, this is how you do music. That cannot be like understated. That cannot be overstated. It is everything that I'm going to go into here. This is not the rules. This is more like our understanding of how things work. And my initial outline for this was going to be a lot longer, but this was very involved in terms of setting up examples. I had to get kind of creative with some interface design type stuff. I had to get creative with thinking about how to illustrate certain ideas, and I really wanted to focus on the math aspect of it, because I feel like that is maybe the most relatable to people with a programming background, as well as the things that are perhaps best illustrated in code. So there's a whole lot of stuff that I am maybe going to kind of gloss on or touch on, but not have examples for, because a lot of my examples are very math based. Um, and the other thing in my outline here, I wanted to just also touch briefly on the concept of tone deafness. I have talked to a lot of people about this sort of stuff in the past who aren't necessarily musicians, and they call themselves tone deaf. And there is an actual thing called amusia that is what we understand as tone deafness. It affects about 4% of the population. Maybe you have it, maybe you don't. Chances are, if you can sing happy birthday even remotely in tune, you don't have it. You just are out of practice. I was told as a kid when I was in maybe fourth grade in choir that I was tone deaf, and it put me off of even attempting to do music stuff for the longest time. And it just like I I don't know. It was one of those early kind of educational experiences that formed what I thought about myself, and it turned out, the teacher, the choir teacher, was wrong. I just had a hard time singing in tune. That's something that requires practice. Go figure. So there's a link in the README here, that if you are curious about amusia, you can go and read more about it. So beyond that, I've got effectively three topics that I kind of want to touch on tonight, and the first one of these is rhythm. Because I'm doing this in JavaScript with the Web Audio API, which I had never actually used before sitting down to write this talk. I wanted to just get an idea as to how to set about this. How do I load up some sounds and play them? So I wanted to create a simple drum beat, and that's what we're going to do for the first section here. And let's see here. You should hear this. And what this is just loading up all the sounds that I have. There is, at least for my percussion, I have in the sounds directory did get checked in, right? sounds directed, oh, public, here we go. Public sounds. There's a couple of percussive sounds in here. There's a couple of other sounds in here that I've recorded either from synthesizers or whatnot. And this first example that's being loaded is, I call it Mayhem, and it just loads up some sounds and tells them to play in a loop based on how long they are. And when you uncheck the box, it tells them to stop. There's nothing too special about here, but because each sound is of a different length, there's no orchestration to them. They just play and loop, and they'll eventually kind of get out of phase, and it doesn't sound very good. And what is needed for rhythm is some sort of concept of a clock. And so I've got to, when I fix this, I think we'll reload the page. It takes a little while sometimes because it has to reload the sounds over web stuff, even though it's local. And this is an attempt at organizing the sounds that are being played into some sort of time. We can go through here, this play beat function, and what this does is it uses the web audio clock from context here to effectively create a bunch of players for the individual sounds and tell them when they should start. I think what I'm doing here is I'm just looking at some very specific modular thing. Sounds 2, if I remember right, is the snare, kind of the ch sound, and sounds 2 is the hat. And every other beat as it is, we're going to play the hat. And then, no. Oh, I see what it's doing here. Okay. What this is doing is going through every, whatever beat time is. What is beat time? Beat time. Okay, beat time is happening about every second. So once a second, it's going to advance this clock. It's going to schedule some sounds to start. One of those is the kick drum, the kind of low thumping sound, and the other is the snare. And in between, it's going to play this kind of high kick sound. And this is the sort of the basic orchestration of what rhythm is. It's just taking a span of time. In this particular case, it's going to be, is tempo being passed in? No. Oh. In this particular case, it is 120 beats per minute, so every half a second. And saying, okay, at the start of our half a second period, we're going to trying to remember what this is exactly doing again. On the first segment, as we progress through the phase, when this is 0, we're going to play the kick drum. When it is basically every other beat, we're going to play the kick drum. And if it is odd, we're going to go ahead and play the snare, as well as effectively on every beat, about halfway through the beat here, we are going to play that hat sound. This is the other thing about this. This is some really messy code. I was working very quickly, and I don't necessarily think that it is the best quality, but the idea was more to illustrate the points. So this one here just kind of keeps track of how many beats we've had and where we are in our phase. So it is a 4-beat cycle, and it just repeats infinitely. It's kind of boring. People will get tired of that after a while. And so one of the things that has evolved at least in modern music, is changing things up over time. So you organize your beats into a certain number of beats per bar, and we call this a meter. And then through that, you might go ahead and have some rules around when these are going to play. And for the most part, when people are doing this, it is a human playing a drum, an actual drum kit, or banging on something with their hands, and they're doing it by feel, or they're programming it into a sequencer where they can kind of click on something. But I'm actually going to do it with modular arithmetic. And this is something that every 4 bars will loop. It changes up the pattern for the hat-like sound, it changes up the pattern for the kick, and the snare drum displays on every second beat in a particular bar. This is, again, it's not something terribly complex. It's a pattern that I have heard in a lot of trip-hop style music, or the kinds of stuff that I listen to, but I mean, I'm old, so I don't know what the kids are listening to these days. But the rough idea behind this is, for any given beat, what this does is it goes through and it schedules samples to play at a particular point in the current bar. The current bar being our beat time, which is 500 milliseconds times 4. So every 2 seconds, it schedules the next 2 seconds worth of audio. And rather than using set timeout to actually say play this now, because the JavaScript clock is somewhat inaccurate, and the notion of timing and tightness is very important to rhythm. The Web Audio API provides us with an actual clock, and I had created this thing to kind of abstract it away, but the idea here is, I think when we're starting, I'm grabbing the current time out of the context plus a little bit of just a tenth of a second to give the browser to kind of catch up. I noticed when I just told things to start now, it missed the current bar and had to wait 2 seconds for the next one to start. It will go through and kind of try to sync up with where we are on that particular clock. And then over time, it just increases how many bars we've rendered and where we are in that cycle. This is, I think, doing it every 4. No, okay, that's not rendering the right thing. But the point of this is that it's dividing up that bar into a certain number of divisions. Sometimes we are playing a kick. Always, for every bar, we're playing a kick at the start of the bar. Sometimes we're playing it a quarter of the way through. Sometimes we're playing it 3/8 of the way through. We're always playing the snare sound halfway through the bar. And I'm using 2 out of 4 here because this is just a little bit more in line with how musicians tend to think of it. You tend to count as humans count and not as computers count. So this would actually be on what is commonly called the 3, but it is halfway through the bar. It plays the hat. What is this? Every second, I think, on 4 different eighth notes, on like eighth divisions through, but offset one a little bit. So it goes boom, where the hat is kind of it sits in between the other things. And sometimes with this 3, it will sit on this 3/8, but it also sits on 5/8. And then on our last cycle in the bar, when we are on the 4th bar through this kind of 4-bar loop that I have, it'll add an additional 2 hats. This is not anything groundbreaking, but the idea is to illustrate that, okay, we are dividing things up and scheduling things to play at particular points through the phase. And there's a lot that I could say about dividing things into other things other than 2. A lot of Western music is focused on taking a particular bar and dividing it into some power of 2, 16th notes, 8th notes, quarter notes, and having things happen on that time. There are ways of perhaps skewing that back and forth with a concept called groove, where you shift the halfway point a little bit. I don't think that's very mathematically interesting, but the idea is that you're pulling or pushing the note forward in time, as if you were taking the sort of linear march of time and bending it one way or the other. And there's some other things that are popular in Western music around taking a particular section of a bar, and rather than dividing it by 2, you divide it by 3, and you end up with triplets. Or rather than having something where it is divided by 2, you divide it into like a chunk of 3/4 and 1/4, for example, with something called dotted notes. None of that stuff I found particularly mathematically interesting, and the code that might have been required to produce it, I didn't want to get into. So what I have after that is I wanted to go into a concept called Euclidean rhythms. And this is something that I've got a link for the actual paper that came out in 2004. And a Euclidean rhythm is basically a way of trying to take one of these phases, these bars, so to speak, divide it up into a certain number of steps and put a certain number of pulses in. And what this paper that came out with found was that a lot of, and not all, but a lot of the world music that we know about through the cultures that we are aware of and their music conforms to this general notion of taking a period of time and putting some number of pulses in, perhaps with an offset of some kind, and coming up with a rhythm. I have on this page loaded up a bunch of these different examples here. The 4/2, 4 steps, 2 pulses is kind of a basic thing that exists in a lot of Western music. You have, this is not right. Okay, well, 2, 3. Oh, no, that is right. Okay. This has to be a lot faster for it to actually make sense. This is a common conga rhythm. You've got what in the West is known as the take 5 rhythm, and where this is 5 steps and you have 2. And the basic idea behind this, behind how this works, is to go through, this is my little JavaScript function that compiles it. You start off with a certain count, and for every, so I have 5 here. You start off with 0. Let's see, I have an offset of 2, so I'm starting, I think, here. And I have 0. And then you add the number of pulses for each step. So I have 0, I have 2. Maybe you start, I have 2, I have 4. And then here I have 6. And once I go over the number of steps, I subtract the number of steps from it and I mark a beat. So I have a beat here, and then I go back down to 1. I add 2 again, so I have 3. And then I add 2 again, and I come back to 5. This is derived from Euclid's algorithm for determining a least common multiple. And it just so happens that a lot of music that exists in the world falls into this pattern. This is a calypso rhythm that exists. I think also this is supposed to be much faster. Not 15,000. This only re-renders every bar, so if I change the time to a really long value on accident, I might just have to reload the page. But you've got a number of different rhythms in here. And this algorithm took a little while to catch on, but it is an idea that has become very popular recently in the last decade or so among modular synthesis crowds, because it provides some easy ways to generate a series of pulses that have a basis in musical history, that without having to go in and manually program something. I've seen a number of different interfaces, both graphical and knob-based, for producing things like this, where you want maybe a particular density or you want a particular kind of feel to something. And one of the things that a lot of these rhythms that have been found in world music have in common is that there is either some prime number involved, or they have a very high, or not, yeah, they have a very high least common multiple. So this rhythm from Cuban music known as the tresillo is, three. You've got your prime number of 3. For this one of the Bulgarian folk music, this is a 7-beat, a 7-beat rhythm, and there's just 4 pulses in there because those, don't have any. It doesn't repeat inside of the pattern. It's got this feel to it where it seems to jump ahead a little bit. In terms of music, like from Western culture that you might know of, that uses some number of beats, it's not 4. I think the 2 most famous examples I can think of are the Mission Impossible theme is a 5/4 rhythm. And if I create this here, here, this 5-step 3-pulse rhythm like this conforms kind of to the Mission Impossible theme. Dun, 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 dun. And the other one that people might know of is Pink Floyd's song Money off of Dark Side of the Moon is a 7-beat bar where the last note, it kind of cycles you can hear it most clearly in the bass line where it goes back down into the lead note and creates this sort of driving forward in using a very similar mechanism to what, in fact, it's on this list right here. I had forgotten about that. There are a whole bunch of these, and I don't want to necessarily go into each of them, but you get into some really fun ones with, I enjoyed this one quite a bit. It has a sort of jilted, janky feeling to it, and it's from a children's song in South Africa. Bossa Nova has these really complex patterns from really high number of steps in a particular bar and a low count. Brazilian sound music has similar things going on like that, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ways you can do that.
You try one of those last ones?
Sure. We'll go down to, let's see, so the Pygmies in Africa.
Cool.
Yeah. And from there, I wanted to go into some ideas around kind of expanding our, I'm going to make this a little wider, expanding our grid a little bit. And so what I did was I took this player and gave it some extra parameters and some extra, basically 4 lanes. And this is what a Euclidean sequencer might look like if you were to try to build one. What I did here was also just, in addition to being able to change sound assignments, added the ability to maybe change the number of pulses for individual things, and then I should probably add a precision number on that, but the idea here is if you can get the steps to line up, or you can get the bars to line up. But this also then touches upon 2 other ideas that exist in world music, a lot more than they do in Western music. And let's see here. I don't know how I can necessarily mute this. I didn't include a playing button. A lot of the later examples I have is a mute button, but I'll try to talk over it. One of the ideas that exists in outside of Western music is the notion of polymeter. And so if I take this back to 2, and I have my kick drum and my snare drum on, actually, I can fire things up quite a bit. Okay. I put these on a different number of steps, and it's going to take, let's see, I think it's going to take, is that a bit more? No, because it's two seconds, okay. What these are is, this one, even though it's 2 seconds long, has 5 steps. And this one is also 2 seconds long, but it has 4 steps. They have the same phase and match the same phase all the time. They'll produce the same pattern. But because these steps don't necessarily line up, it creates a different feel than you might have otherwise. This is a really fun way to play with rhythms and explore them. There weren't examples that I could find of polyrhythm in world music that I could very easily plug into a Euclidean sequencer like this. It's still something that, like, because the paper didn't even come out until 2004, so this is still something that a lot of musicologists are still sort of like researching, kind of wrapping their heads around. But you can create some really interesting things this way using effectively math that's been around for a really long time and lines up with a lot of things that have existed in the world. So if your goal was to create music for some culture that never existed as part of a fictional series, this might be a good way to start. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is polyrhythm. And what this would involve doing is both taking a different meter as well as a different length of time. And I'm going to bump this up a little bit.
It's a clap.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to kick this to maybe 21, and I'll put 8 on here. And if I get this so that it's not on a clean phase, let's say I'm going to get this on 7 seconds, and maybe 3 and 21 hits. So it's almost half, but not quite. Or maybe not quite like that. Because these are effectively out of phase, and I can even reset the phases, but because they will become and drift gradually more and more out of phase over time, a lot of different patterns can emerge from it. This concept is a lot more popular, or I should say, a lot more in use in African music, particularly tribal drum beats or whatnot, and you have singing circles. But it is something that it has existed in, that Western music has borrowed, at least drawn inspiration from at times, and people have experimented with it. One thing that I was going to make a separate section on and then decided to fold into this is, if you were to take these and make them really long, let's say 13 and 20 and we'll do 11, and you give them all maybe prime numbers. We'll do 17 here. And even though 20 is not a prime number, it is, maybe I'll make this a little bit more like that. Okay, now it's got some actual meat to it. Because these will not loop for a very long time, this table over here shows effectively how long it will take before they sync back up again. In this particular case, it's almost 10 minutes before it syncs back up again. This is something that has been used to create ambient music. In particular, like, if you were to record a melody into one of these and a drum beat into another, you would have the basic principles behind, for example, Brian Eno's music for airports. where you have these kind of phrases that are sparse and don't really line up with each other, and the interplay with them over time is something that doesn't get boring over a long extended listen, but still is based off of some pretty simple principles. And that is...
I hear what you're saying, and I have listened to a lot of Brian Eno.
I mean, I'm not saying that this is like the derivation of a lot of Brian Eno, but
why not though? Why not though?
Why not what?
Why is it not a broad derivation of Brian Eno? I mean, it sounds good to me.
You know, I don't know that. While Brian Eno pioneered this kind of idea, perhaps in Western music, I don't know that he would necessarily be the first. Some of these ideas are things that other cultures have played with for a long time, and you know, the Euclidean algorithm also doesn't explain how some of the rhythms in, for example, North Indian raga music works. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it, and this was something that I felt could be fun to demo and produce some interesting ideas. You know, some interesting ways of saying like, oh, okay, I get a little bit more about how rhythm works now, where somebody might not have before.
That was a good answer. I don't think that I do have, you know, the I don't think I'm the speaker.
Anyway, one of the fun things that you can do with this too is just kind of get these things roughly lined up, but not all the way. Maybe I'll do this with 20 so that these times more or less line up, but not quite. This is one of the reasons why I put this down here. I figured I could either walk the time or the step time, but not both. And because even though I do human interface design for a living, I just felt like, okay, I should walk one or the other, and I decided to walk the step time and have our time be the canon. But now these things are more or less to the point where the steps will line up, and it might feel a little bit more like Western music. It's a fun, you know, there's a fun little playground with here in this. I played with it for a little while after I had it built up, and I kind of want to make something that I can actually hook up to like a drum machine. But that's what I have to talk about rhythm. The next part of this is going to start with a concept called timbre and go into harmony. And timbre is what I might describe as how you distinguish a plucked, what distinguishes the sound of somebody singing from a guitar playing, or from a ukulele, or from an oboe, or any other perhaps type of musical instrument. You can also use it to describe the difference between percussion sounds or even different types of noises. But for our purposes, where I'm using this more as a foundation for understanding harmony, I want to look at things that are typically considered musical. And what I have here is an analyzer, and this is something that is built into the Web Audio API, and I've built both something that it'll draw a waveform, and this might require a little bit of a primer on sound. You know, where time is an essential. Jeremy, can you mute?
Welcome.
Okay. where time is an essential part of rhythm, one thing that is perhaps a little bit difficult to appreciate about music is, or about sound in general, is that it requires two things. It requires time and atmosphere. What we call sound is air molecules vibrating. And it's not that they are moving the way that, say, wind might move an air molecule around, but rather I have, for example, a speaker in my headphone. I've got a speaker on my desk right here, and it has a magnet in it. And a current goes to the magnet, and it moves the speaker back and forth. And that produces vibrations in the air. And it's not so much that the air is being pushed from the speaker to my ear. With my headphones, it might be, but rather that is causing the air to vibrate, and that causes neighboring bits of air to vibrate. And this is a process that happens over time. And this waveform drawing that is being created here, kind of jankily, is an attempt at representing what that vibration looks like. I think that it more closely measures like what an electrical signal to the magnet might look like than what the actual air looks like. It's not, an attempt at illustrating vibrating air molecules, but this is what we would call a time domain analysis of the sound. And then this display that's moving very slowly down here is actually using another fun bit of math, and I have this linked in here, called the fast Fourier transform. And what this does is it breaks down the incoming sound into frequency bins, and then it attempts to illustrate the volume that is happening at those frequency bins. So for each of these percussion sounds, it takes up a wide band of noise. For this sound of myself saying ah, you can see that some of these frequency bins are highlighted more than the others. And that means that there's more energy in those frequency bins. The basic idea behind this has been around for a while. There's a really good illustration of how these work from a kind of mathematical standpoint at this link here. It's a fun interactive exploration of it. And it will basically teach you how you can draw any closed two-dimensional shape with sine waves. One of the interesting things about about fast Fourier transform analysis is the idea that given enough detail about the energy for a particular frequency bin over time, and with particular phase information, you could, in theory, recreate any sound. And in fact, this is the fundamental basis behind, for example, MP3 compression, is that it takes this very rich, these are uncompressed wave files here, but it takes this very effectively rich waveform sound that we have that comes through the time domain analysis, does a frequency domain analysis on it, compresses it into sine waves, and then rehydrates that back into the through the MP3 decoder back into something that a normal audio signal would that we would recognize as a normal audio signal. This is
quick question for clarification there. Would you say there's like an analogy between that process and vectorizing a raster image?
No.
Okay.
Vectorizing a raster image is more around perhaps looking for patterns in the raster image and trying to go with those and maybe meet a certain amount of detail. You oftentimes have to do things like edge detection or whatnot. In this particular case, for I think, let's see here. For this one, I don't want to shut down my little web server here. For this particular thing, where'd my README go? All right. For this particular analysis, I think it's using some number of bins for the Fourier transform, and that is 4,096. These are distributed linearly across the frequency spectrum. We have these samples, I think, are rendered at either 48 kilohertz or 44.1 kilohertz. 44.1 kilohertz being the sample rate of compact discs. And that number was chosen because it is roughly double the upper end of human hearing. People can hear things up to about 22,000 kilohertz. And I didn't create a link to this, but there is another bit of math. And this is, well, pretty much everything in sound and our understanding of sound involves math. The Nyquist theorem states that for sampling any particular sound wave, if you want to represent it accurately, you need at least twice the number of samples as the frequency that exists. And if you don't have that, then what happens is it creates frequencies that weren't in the source material. This is the principle behind a popular audio effect called bit crushing, is just taking the sampling rate and reducing it, introducing new, very odd harmonics into the sound. So this is my chimes outside. This is the longest sample I have in here. And what you can see in here is I've got 4,096 bins. These are compressed into about 512 pixels tall. Most of the energy is down here in the bottom end. That's because this right here is about, I think, 10,000, 11,000 hertz. Personally, I am very hard of hearing with a severe frequency drop off above 6,000 hertz, which would be about here. As it happens, a lot of the aspects of human speech that that allow us to distinguish consonants from each other happen at right about 6,000 to 7,000 hertz, and so that's why I wear hearing aids most of the time when I'm talking with people, especially when I'm talking with people whose accents I'm unfamiliar with, is that it just helps bridge that gap a lot. But for musical information, a lot of the bulk of what we're going to hear is kind of down in the lower range of this. So I have a bunch of different sounds here. The percussion sounds that I showed earlier, these ones are synthesized. The clap is recorded out of a microphone. And then for the rest of them, I basically took my field recorder and went around. And the water sample is the closest thing I have to noise. And as you can see, there's a lot of energy that happens all over the frequency spectrum here. It seems like there is just, there's a lot of sound everywhere in the frequency spectrum. And that is kind of how noise works. There are different shades of noise in the audio world, but when you turn on, if you're of my age and you remember when you could turn on the TV and not have it go to a specific channel and just get the white noise static screen, that sound that you would get, the kind of sound, is this sort of thing where it just exists in all sorts of all different parts of the frequency spectrum. But one of the things that sounds that we kind of define as musical have in common is that they have a lot of energy in particular frequency bins. This is just a metal cooking bowl that we have. This is a cup that I have. And as you can see, there's a lot of energy that seems like it's very oddly distributed across the frequency spectrum. But things that are maybe a little bit more traditionally thought of as musical, like for example, a piano, if you look at this, there's a very straightforward pattern that happens here. These lines are very evenly distributed. I have an instrument called a melodica. I probably should have made that one quieter. This is an instrument that I have called a melodica. It is kind of like a cross between a harmonica and an accordion. You play it with your breath. Let's see here. Again, this is myself saying ah. I have a pluck on the ukulele. And then last but not least, my guitar going through an overdrive pedal. And one of the things that I hope is kind of clear from this is that all of these sounds that we might define as musical have a lot of energy over the frequency spectrum, but lined up in this particular way. And this is something that we call overtones, where we might, for a particular note or for a particular thing, say that it has a fundamental frequency at the base, and then everything that happens above that is kind of an overtone. If I were to look at the particular frequency that this particular bit of energy is at, and then go up from here, they would actually be more or less integer multiples of each other. So this is a screen that has a very basic what's called additive synthesizer, and this was the one where I added the mute button. By default, it uses sine waves, and the 375 frequency is just chosen because it makes at that frequency it doesn't move. It's kind of locked to this, so the animation stays still. But if I have these 12 individual little oscillators going here to add sine waves in, and if I make my own overtones like this, where for this down here is it is similar to the spectrogram, the frequency analysis that I had in the previous one. It just doesn't show history. It only shows what's going on right now. So this is my 375 hertz tone. A sine wave is kind of unique in that it has no overtones. It is more or less a pure sound. I had a very hard time getting the web audio API to mute these entirely, but these are all my other partials that exist in here. And if I unmute this as we go up, as I start bringing in these whole number overtones that exist at these particular frequencies, it starts to sound more like an organ or one of these other more musical sounds that we have that were demonstrated earlier. And this is, I'm not doing any funny stuff here to these overtones. They are just lining up linearly like this. Let's see if I mute all these again. I can go into some other waveforms that are provided via the Web Audio API for doing synthesis. A triangle wave has a certain number of natural overtones that taper as you go up the frequency spectrum. A sawtooth wave is very rich in them, and therefore it's something that is the basis for a lot of synthesis. And a square wave, actually similar to the melodica, is missing the even numbered ones. If I were to bring up the one here at the second partial, you see how it kind of fills those in a little bit. And then I think if let's see, 1, 2, 3, so if I bring up the fourth one here, then it brings up some of those, but it only has the odd numbered harmonics. And this is actually, that is a property of a lot of reed instruments as well. A lot of the woodwind instruments that you play with a reed will be missing the odd numbered harmonics, the even numbered harmonics. But because a sawtooth wave has effectively all of these individual overtones, and if I go in here and add, we get a little bit of phase shifting as I bring in the new ones. But you see, the waveform is kind of getting a little bit tortured there, but and these are shifting around a little bit, but no individual new space is being added. And if I were to, for example, just bring this down to here and move this off of the second overtone a little bit, you can see, I don't know if this sounds dissonant to you, I don't know how well it's coming through, but it should sound at least very ominous or very kind of not musical.
Definitely ominous.
And as I get away from this a little bit, the overtones just stop lining up. Where this is this is useful for a number of reasons, but one of the things that I feel I'm going to switch over to the triangle wave real quickly. One of the things that at least the ancient Greeks are the first like people who we know of to kind of discover these, is that they would notice that when you, for example, plucked a string and you took a string of roughly the same gauge and either halved or doubled its length, it would kind of sound the same. So if I have this particular note and I add in one with double the frequency, it doesn't seem to, I mean, it makes the notes sound a little bit richer, but it more or less doesn't feel different the way that bringing the third one kind of sounds like a different thing. And this forms the basis of a concept in music that pretty much all cultures around the world have, which in Western music we call the octave for reasons that I will get into later. But the general idea is that if you double or halve the frequency of any particular tone, our ears hear it as the same thing. Maybe it's higher or lower in its actual pitch, but to our ears, it more or less sounds identical. Whereas
Matthew, how about if you did a 4 or quadrupled it? Would it also kind of have that same?
Because 4 is a multiple of 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, 4 is a power of 2. Excuse me. 6 is a multiple of 2,
Yeah.
but it is a power of. In this particular case, it is 3. It is 3 to the second power. So I have 2 to the first power, 2 to the second power, and this is 2 to the 0th power. And then the other one here, 2 to the third power. These are all in the same, effectively what we would call a pitch class. These are all multiples of my base frequency here. And for the purposes of harmonics, we tend to treat these as identical, where you have this number being some power of 2 above the base. So 8 is 2 to the 4th power for this particular thing. Now, if I multiply this times 3 and bring in my third harmonic here, and I bring in my root for comparison, and then I bring in my other 3, 2 ones that I have. Those are all kind of related to each other. So my interface that I have over here, what this fraction does is it effectively folds the base frequency down into some whole number kind of thing. And because this is limited to hundredths over here, it will, I think, at most go to like something over 200. This folds it into the range of, even if this were, let's say, 12.2, it still folds it into the range between 1 and 2. This is 303 200ths above the fundamental. And this basis is our foundation for understanding harmony. You can do, this is also an interface that uses a synthesis technique called additive synthesis that's been modestly popular. It's a really difficult thing to master, but it's been around for a long time. And the idea is that you just take a couple of simple oscillators and add them together, usually with long harmonic multiples like this, and just add the sounds together to get different timbres. One of the things, though, about this is the only times where new overtones that sound different to each other are really introduced are in places where something is not on a power of 2 of a previous number in the series. So 4 is a power of 2 of, you know, of our original. 5 is not. 6 is a power of 2 for the third overtone. 7 is not, and so on. But 10 is a doubling of 5, and you know, I can go in and add any number of these particular things. I could have, if I wanted to, I could have made this screen behave similar to a couple of commercial additive synthesizers that I played with, where they go up to the 64th harmonic. And you can really play around with those to get richer sounds, so to speak. But that's not the point of this. The point is to illustrate that how the overtones line up and how they don't line up if you start to get them just a little bit out of phase with each other. Conversely, like if you wanted to make a more metallic type sound, like the metal bowl and cup that I had, a good way to do that might be to go with odd numbers. Let's say we'll get pi in there. You know, this is something that sounds really, I don't know, dissonant and alien. But this is this effectively attempting to looking at these overtones and trying to figure out how they line up, or trying to get them to line up with each other, is some of the point of harmony. So going into that, one of the things that the Greeks noticed is, you know, this idea that, okay, well, if you have strings with integer length multiples of each other or fractions of each other, that they sounded good together. And I'm going to get a little bit more into this particular screen, but I have a sawtooth synthesizer hooked up to these things that produce ratios. And the Greeks, or at least Pythagoras, this is named, this particular style of tuning that I'm going to go into here is called Pythagorean tuning. And it's based off of taking the 3/2, or the third overtone, and attempting to kind of shift that. So if I add, you know, I have two individual things here, and this is a drawing that I did to effectively try to show how these would line up. And you know what? I'm going to quiet this a little bit because it's really loud. I'd like to have sound, but I don't want it to be super loud. I thought in here I have a lot of support code for this. I think, where is it doing this? Ramp to value at time. Let's try something a little bit quieter than that. Okay, that's a little bit better. If I sound two sawtooth waves at the same time, where they are exactly the first is exactly 1.5 times, or in this particular case 3 times as long, but I'm folding it back down, so I guess half again as long as the original, but they have this ratio of 3 to 2. The overtones really line up and they sound great. So what happens then if we add another 3/2 above that? What happens if we multiply 1.5 times 1.5? Well, it doesn't come back around. Multiplying 1.5 times itself does not give you 1. Rather, it gives you something more than 1. And folding that back into the range of 1 to 2, it gives us 9/8. So this still gives us a really nice, rich sound with each other. But if I put these two together, you know, they're kind of close to each other and they still sound pretty decent. So what happens if we go up another one? We get to 27/16. It's like, ooh, wow, okay, we're really getting out there now. And so this is a little bit kind of like starting to get, oh, this sounds okay, but maybe not as nice as some of the other ones do.
Sorry, can you say a little bit more? You're multiplying and then folding back into. Can you
correct. Okay, so the rough idea here is that for getting 3/2, I'm multiplying 1 times 3, and then dividing it by 2, so that it is once again between one and two. Because two is, if I go back here and assert that two is equivalent to one in terms of how they sound, where the overtones more or less line up and some of them are highlighted with each other. If I take that basis, and this is something that pretty much every culture's music in the world takes for granted, is that when you double or halve a frequency, it is equivalent to the original frequency in terms of its what I would call a pitch class. If I take that number, multiply it by 3, and then bring that back down into the range of 1 and 2, so that it is not as high as the original 3. So I'm effectively halving this 3 so that it's equivalent. These two are the same note. So if I come back over here, what this is doing is it's multiplying by 3 and then dividing by 2 so that it is between 2 and 1. So that it's providing it's filling up that space between the overtones. And then again, I'm multiplying my 1.5, or I'm multiplying my 3 over 2 here by 3 again, or 1.5 again in this particular case, and then dividing by 2 until it gets back into the range of between 1 and 2. And then again, I'm multiplying by 1.5 and dividing by 2. When I start getting up a little bit more, we get into some really weird, we start getting into some really out there intervals, where an interval is what you might call the space between two different notes. These sound okay.
Yeah.
But here the overtones barely line up at all. They kind of fall in and out of phase with each other, and it sounds a little bit weird. You're getting into like 128ths now. So I'm going to back that down to 3, and I'm going to start. Then I start asking the question, well, if this is what happens when I multiply by 1.5, what? And multiplying by 1.5 doesn't equal 1 again. If I don't come right back around, it overshoots a little bit. What happens if what is the note that would produce this original 1? What happens if I take effectively what you would call the inverse of this 1.5? What is the number that you would, what can you multiply by itself to and then divide by 2 to get to 1? And so that is, in that particular case, that would be 4/3. And this is really like, in this particular case, it's not multiplying by itself, but what can you multiply by 1.5 to get to our original fundamental? And so in this particular case, if I multiply this by 1.5, I would get to 400. And I think, no. I get to,
Hey, is this Matthew?
Yes. I'm Matthew.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi. 266.67 times 1.5 gives me 400. So this is, if I were to take the inverse of 1.5, I would get down to 4/3 here. And I can keep this series going. And if I do this again, and again, I end up with, maybe not again, but if I have, let's see, if I end up with these, I think these particular 5 notes, no, actually, we're going to go with just one down here. This effectively stacked series of third overtones that have been folded back into the range of 1 to 2. This forms the basis for a series of notes that you'd call the pentatonic scale. You've got 5 particular notes in your thing. So if you might ask, like, okay, well, if 1.5 is not roughly halfway through, because if I multiply, if I multiply it by itself again, I end up here. How would I display this in a way that is maybe, to our understanding, a little bit more linear? And the answer is logarithms. If I pull down if I bring back my effectively undertone, the note that whose third overtone produces our original basis here, you can see that these are kind of the inverse of each other on this circle. So this is a little bit lower than this sound, and my 8164 is a little bit lower than that. If I do think, no, come on. I hate Windows sometimes. Wait, not the right one. That is this one. Here we go. 3 and 3 of each. If I get to this particular point where I have 7 of these, three third overtones stacked onto each other up, and 3 that are effectively what you might imagine to be the note that produces the third overtone of the previous one in the series, you get 7 notes that are kind of nicely and evenly distributed around a scale, and at this, or around our circle. And if I were to at this point start to label them, and in a particular manner, I'm going to, and going around from our 1, if I'm going to say, like, well, maybe I want to have some letters for these. Let's see here. Where might I start? And actually, I'm going to start here in the middle with D, because they will line up a little bit more better. But if I go around in my circle here and start labeling these with letter names that people might be familiar with, if you seen, if you've, well, yeah, and F. Then I have the basis for at least Western music tonality here in 7 notes that are roughly put into a particular space around a scale. They all have a varying amount of different relationships to each other, where going from, let's say, C to E at the same time doesn't sound all that great. C to B next to each other, I think, sounds terrible. While those sound good, this one sounds kind of abysmal. There's also still a lot of space in between, and I can go up a few more and down a few more, and I think got most of the way there. But here's where we're starting to fill in gaps that didn't exist, and we're starting to fill in gaps in between the individual things. And when the theories behind this were being created, this is at a time where you could, like, your options for making noise were limited, and your ability to do complex math was somewhat limited, and so you could sing these particular pitches or notes, and maybe you're doing it in a Greek Colosseum, maybe you're doing it in a cave, and maybe you're doing it in a forest, or you've got some stringed instruments that you need to actually measure a length of string for and tune to a particular thing, or you've got a pipe that you're drilling holes into to help you produce sound, and those holes need to be placed at particular points on the pipe. And so, rather than trying to introduce new letters, and because even today a lot of our music still limits itself to just 7 notes, for its repertoire of things. What I can do here is, rather than saying, okay, well, I'm going to introduce, H as a new note, or go up to J. We're going to start looking at some of these and say, okay, well, 81 out of 64 is effectively above F in our relationship here. I might look at this particular thing and say, well, it's below G, but because I'm going up, I'm going to treat it as something that is like superior to F. And this is what we might call an F sharp. At least that's the nomenclature that developed around it. And then going to 243 over 128, I would call this, say, C sharp. And then going the other way, going below F to 128 over 81, I would call this one B flat. And going down to our last one here, this would go down to E flat, where this is the thing that exists below E. Now, the prize was seeking out these nice ratio numbers with low fractional values like 16 over 9, or ideally 3 over 2, but things that sounded pleasant. And eventually, going when you start comparing to our fundamental here, when you go to E flat and play that, it sounds very, very off and just doesn't sound terribly good at all. It still sounds really nice when these two are played with each other. And so if you're trying to orchestrate some people singing together in some sort of harmony, then you would want to have them limited. You would want to have them stay together on this effectively left or right scale, because if you start getting too far from each other, it starts sounding really, really off. And you might also then look at like, oh, there's this big gap in the middle here. What happens there? And it turns out that if you add another, if you go another particular way, another step out, they overshoot each other. So this would become G sharp, and this would become A flat, and they overlap. And there's some really ugly tones in here. I think this particular one here with E flat versus G sharp, this was at least, yeah, here, 2 to the 18th power over 3 to the 11th power. This is linked in the README. This is the page on Pythagorean tuning.
Isaac, come here.
Jeremy, you need to mute again, please. It's something that they call the Wolf interval. And it sounds kind of terrible. And if you're trying to maybe construct some harmonies that maybe are a little less confined to one specific area or the other, you've got a few options, one of which is either find maybe if you're on a instrument that is not limited to fixed pitches, let's say your voice, or a stringed instrument that is that doesn't have frets, where you can play effectively all the notes in between the notes. You're not limited to, say, like on a piano, saying playing a particular well-defined pitch for that. You could readjust to these ratios on your own as you go, and that's what people started to do. But for instruments need retuning. It requires a lot of skill to do that. I don't consider myself a terribly good singer, and I can harmonize with other people on the third overtone pretty easily. But if I wanted to harmonize, say, for this particular thing where it's the second third overtone, or the third overtone of the third overtone, that would be really difficult for me to do without a lot of practice. And it gets even weirder This is effectively multiplying by 3 and then dividing by 2 again and again and again. And because we've effectively got these powers of 2 and powers of 3 that are going up and around, if we keep going, then we eventually start lapping around to the point where we have these little offsets with each other again and again and again. And if I bring these, let's see, if I bring this back down and I crank this one up all the way so that everything is derived from the fundamental of D, and I go back around, even if this is not how things actually work, but if I were to go around 12 times, one might expect that things would line up, but they don't. There's this little gap that exists between taking the third overtone of the third overtone of the third overtone 12 times to the point where I get back around. And this is something that, at least in this particular system, is called, well, this particular little interval is called a comma. This particular one is called the Pythagorean comma. And it is just due to the fact that taking these, a power of 3 to the second power will never line up with 2 to the second power again. You can keep multiplying this stuff ad infinitum. And I don't think I let it go up to 12, but that was about it. But you'll still get these slightly adjacent kind of things with each other. So the kind of advancement in tuning from here was, in theory at least, you had these monks that were doing their chanting in cathedrals, and they started to hear the 5th overtone of their own voices in a chamber or space that was a little bit more resonant and able to kind of bring that out. And so they took that idea and started playing with it a little bit more to give themselves a system for producing richer harmonies. And so if I have my basics here again of 4/3, 1, 3/2, and 9/8. But if I start then adding in the 5/4, wait, no, I don't want down, I want up. If I start adding in 5/4 above it to find the 5th overtone, I'm taking I'm taking my fundamental frequency here of 200. I'm multiplying it times 5 to get 1,000, and then I'm dividing it by 2 to get 500, and I'm dividing it by 2 again to get 250, where it's between 200 and 400. Then the theory is that this will produce a note that is harmonious with the fundamental note. And so I can take my 5th again, and you know what? I need to crank the volume on that down too. Down here. I'm happy to take questions on the code afterwards if people are going through it. It is mostly, I've been using React for 7 years now, and I know it really well, and this is kind of an attempt to just get a web page going quickly. But if I take my fundamental, play my 5th with it, and then play my 3rd with it, I get something that sounds really nice. And I should clarify here, I'm using, on my Pythagorean one, I think I did maybe 3 up and 3 down. And, what? Maybe not 3 down. Oh wait, no, there we go. Okay, now they line up again. In this particular style of calling notes, you would refer to the particular note by counting, and because this was really done before the invention of 0, you started counting with 1 like normal people do. So when referring to these numbers, maybe from a particular basis, and this is a nomenclature that persists to this day, you call the fundamental or the 1, and then you go to the second note in your selection of notes, and you call it the 2 and the 3 and the 4 and the 5. Here my 1 and my 3rd don't sound all that great with each other. Or my 1 and my 3. My 1 and my 4 sound good. My 1 and my 5 sound good. And maybe the third doesn't sound. The thirds in this particular case were not considered very harmonious. They were considered kind of dissonant and ugly sounding in comparison, but they were there to be available. Just wanted to explain that aspect of it. But when I take this again, and if I were to label these, going back to my original notes again, of D, G, A, in this particular case, I think it would be F. No. Right? G, A, E. This one, no, this is G, this is, I've worked these examples out with F. E uses F. Okay, well, these aren't exactly, if I do this with C, it makes a lot more sense because, so I'm just going to do that. If I plunk these around in the circle again, there we go. I still haven't labeled this one over here, but I come back to my 7 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and playing any particular set where I have the 5th note above the basis and a chord, and the 3rd note above, it sounds roughly pretty good. Now I could try to get back to the 12 notes that I had originally, where they didn't line up, by expanding my 3rd overtone series again. That produces some stuff, but it has some overlap. This one again has some overlap, but fills in some other gaps. But just as we asked the question of what is the note that produces the 3rd overtone, or the note that for which this is our 3rd overtone, one might then also ask, well, what is the note for which this is the 5th overtone? And so we can expand this down another particular way and start labeling these a little bit more. And because we have our 7 notes already, we can go back to our sharp and flat nomenclature that had already been in use and start looking at these. And so 16/15ths we might call D flat in this particular case. 6/5ths we would call E flat. 45/32 we're going to, because this is above these in the series, we're going to call F sharp. For our 8/5ths, we're going to call this A flat, and then for 9/5ths, we're going to call this B flat. And we have, as long as you stick to these particular series of three notes where they have this relationship of the 5th and 3rd overtones with each other, they sound pretty good. And this was I did that one. This was a breakthrough in tuning and allowed for a lot more ambitious ways of orchestrating and writing music and producing harmony with other things. It's not perfect. There are, you've got a couple of wolf intervals again, and if I look at my Wikipedia page, this is the link in here, this is called 5-limit tuning because it is based on, constrained by the prime number of 5. We go to, I think it's like B flat and A is one of these wolf intervals, but if I go to like E flat and B, we get, play that, E flat and B. Oh yes, these are kind of ugly.
Yeah, I get what Matt is saying. I go to C sharp, B flat minor, and that's kind of my home.
We can create some really ugly sounds through here. One of the other things too is that this also creates a disruption with some of the intervals of fifth notes. So while C and G sound good and line up nicely, and E and B line up nicely, D and A no longer line up nicely.
What?
D and A are no longer 3/2. I have this table here that attempts to extrapolate out all the ratios that these have with each other. So the relationship between D and A is not 3/2 anymore, it's 40/27. Or in the opposite case, 27/20. It is not that perfect fifth note that we had gotten before. It is in this particular case, I think we might call it. So D to A would be fourth, but A to D we might call this because it is, I think, slightly smaller than normal. 27. I don't know what half of 27 would be off the top of my head, but I think we might call this maybe a diminished one. There are a lot of different kinds of intervals that exist in here, and not a lot of them sound kind of ugly. This is another one of the wolf intervals. The legend has it that this particular combination of notes was banned by the church because it was the sound of the devil. The fact that F sharp is 6 above C, just made it lent credence to that legend. I don't know if that's actually true or not. But there are some really kind of ugly sounds in here that exist at the edges. Even though you count up 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, so that is going up this way. But if I were to go, I think from here, if I go B flat to F, it's the same thing that happened with the D and the A before, going from F sharp to D flat again. It doesn't sound, it doesn't, that also sounds very different from going from D to A. And so this was, trying to remember where I was going with this now. This provided a nice set of ways to, a nice set of guidelines for figuring out how you should run string lengths and design instruments and drill holes and pipes to create sound, and mostly worked with each other. And there was a lot of different variations on this that existed over the centuries, but they all had their own kind of problems. This particular way of doing things is called just intonation, and they all and that is derived from the basis that there is effectively small whole number fractions at its root. A lot of tuning systems that have existed throughout the world, throughout history, have been based off of this sort of principle.
Are you sure it wasn't just-in-time tonation, like the programming term?
Yes, I'm sure.
Okay, just
checking. It's not JIT tonation. It is because that is actually something you can do with a computer, or if you're in an a cappella group, it's something that you can do with well-trained singers. And one of the things that actually, one of the things that I wanted to illustrate and figured I didn't have the time for, and I could just kind of mention, is that there are, because this is 5-limit tuning, where you have the prime number of 5 as your basis, your limit for kind of deriving frequencies. There is 7-limit tuning and 9-limit tuning and 11-limit tuning, and 9's not a prime number there, but it's also not a, like, it doesn't exist in our previous in our previous thing here. 9 is its own beast in this regard. So it's not a prime number, but it's not something that was covered by an existing system. And like 7 limit tuning doesn't have a lot of basis in world music. For the most part, a lot of cultures stopped at 5. But what is interesting is the culture that we know of that used the 7th overtone as a basis for creating a tuning system was in West Africa, where a lot of people who were enslaved were brought over to the United States and played their music and brought their music with them. And that became the basis for the blues. The blues are considered today distinctly American music, but it uses the 7th harmonic, particularly in what we might call in the blue third and in the blue note, which exist on 7 prime number ratios, kind of in between existing notes. The main example that I'm familiar with of this that people might know of is actually a parody of blues notes, but it is something that people are familiar with. In after the traditional Happy Birthday song, you have the kind of chorus where people go into "and many more," and that "more" sound is based off of the 7th overtone and 7 limit tuning, but it's done so in that kind of wobbly more, like as a parody and as a jape at blues music. And it was created out of that. It was created to poke fun at the blues. The other thing, because music is influences other music and whatnot, and people try to make things their own. The other place where you see the 7th overtone, and particularly on an instrument, the human voice, where it is not limited to fixed pitches, is barbershop quartets and barbershop harmonies, where they will do just-in-time tonation, effectively the singers will align themselves with each other, and rather than limit themselves to fixed pitches on a grid, will just dynamically create harmonies as needed for their particular whatever their effect they're trying to create. But they don't have to retune their piano to do that. They don't have to pull out their guitar and twiddle the tuning pegs on the fly. They're just really well-trained singers, and typically as a group able to work together really well and able to literally feel the resonation in their bodies of the harmonics with each other. But this still exhibited a number of problems. The 3rd notes sound really nice with each other. The 5th notes sound really nice to each other, and some of the other notes still sound really nice to each other. But as you got into the Baroque era, in particular, the era of Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and them, the composers started getting ambitious, and the audiences started getting more sophisticated, and they wanted to be able to do things like change keys on the fly, where a key is, I'm saying this is C, and everything is kind of based off of that. They wanted to get a lot more sophisticated with how these pitches were, how they would be able to move around the harmonic space, so to speak. And so, I pointed out earlier that this is roughly logarithmic. Our half and our 4/3 exist as opposites of each other on this around a middle. Well, if we had 12 notes and they exist on a logarithmic spectrum, it would make sense that instead of using fractions to display this, we might want a unit of measurement for these that reflects the logarithmic nature of it. Because looking at stuff, I can understand 5/4, but as I said earlier, 27/20, I'm not sure off the top of my head where that exists without really looking at it. It's not on this. This ratio is only created between the interplay of the ratios that existed otherwise. And so this came about sometime after the next thing I'm going to go into, but we have a unit of measure called the cent, and this is not the sense of dollars, but rather the idea is that between in our circle here, we're going to divide it up into 1,200 equal parts, and then from there we can locate where particular notes go. And refer to them in a way that's logarithmic and look at these numbers, and I can see that this particular relationship here between what might be called G, let's see, I'll just go ahead and plug these back in again, and 9/8 of D. Oh, okay, that's right, G and D, and then A and E and B. So while D to G is 701.96 of these cents that produces this 3/2 ratio. Let's see, so that is D to G, that is G to D. So D to A is less than that. This is my diminished fifth, and this is a little bit easier to reason about than trying to look at fractions and, you know, maybe converting that into a decimal form. It also reflects the logarithmic nature of it, so that I can look at another thing that might be, if I don't think I have anything here that, well, I've got a couple in here that, like, from C to D is 203.9 cents, roughly 204 cents. But C to D flat is a little bit more than 111. So the space between C to D flat is not the space between D flat and D. And there are, you know, like I mentioned, there are some really ugly sounds in here, and I think that is one of them. But if I put it up to the next octave where they're not right next to each other, it's still kind of a yikes. That is, let's avoid that kind of sound. And so people started playing around with these tuning systems, trying to find ways to avoid or roughly try to avoid the problems that exist with pitches, be able to go from this to that in a way that sounded nice. And rather than go into what everybody did, I'm going to go at what we've arrived at, which is the tuning system we have today. And this is actually based on taking our 1,200 cents around the circle. And just as, let's see now, you know, one of the things about, no, I don't want two down, I want one down. You know, roughly what happens here is you have your notes line up at about the hundreds. We have 12 of these notes. They don't perfectly line up. Some of them are a little bit off, but for the most part, it would be really difficult for people to hear the difference. And so what happens if you then equally space your pitches logarithmically around the pitch space? And so that's what this system that we use today called equal temperament is. And so I have my my octave, as it were called, in a 7-note scale that an octave would refer to 8 notes. And that terminology has been around for a long time and you know, persists. But I can take roughly any of these particular things, and the overtones don't line up perfectly, but they're close enough. It doesn't sound too bad. And it's going to have the same kind of character. It's going to be a different pitch, but it's going to have the same character and the same predictable nature as anything else. And there's our fifth, and it's not perfect, and then you can kind of hear a little bit of things going in and out of phase. But in acoustic music, where if I'm singing, my voice is going to wobble a little bit. Really well-trained singers won't have any wobble in their voice, and really well-trained violin players won't have any wobble in their voice. But for the most part, acoustic instruments are constantly falling apart. My melodica will collect spit in it, and that changes the sound of it, and so I have to drain it periodically. I have an electric guitar and a ukulele, and they need to be retuned every now and then. Actually, reading through an interview with the producer George Martin, not the creator of Game of Thrones, but the person who recorded a lot of the Beatles music. One of the things that he said in lamenting the state of music today, and maybe this is a like get off my lawn kids kind of thing, is that a lot of music produced in the 80s and after, they will retune their instruments in between takes, whereas in his day, in my day, when he was recording the Beatles, they would just kind of keep going and the instruments would get out of tune a little bit, and it didn't matter because what they wanted to get was the spirit of the music recording and to get a good sound, to get a really good take. And that flow was more important to him than the perfectness of the instruments being in tune. So maybe it doesn't matter so much that these are slightly off. Our third, this is our, if I start labeling these here, going around in a circle with, let's see, so these are, this will be D flat, D, E flat, F, no, E, F, we'll call this F sharp again, G, G flat, not G flat, A flat. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily matter too much. The point of this is more that these have a particular. They are linear in the ascending order as they go around the circle. If I have my triad that existed before, it doesn't maybe sound as perfectly nice as the justly intoned one did, but it sounds good enough. And the only really dissonant interval that exists in here is between, that wolf interval that I showed earlier, the one that was based off of the number 6 that, the church had supposedly banned. But even then, this one, which is, this one, which is based off of the square root of 2, this does not sound nearly as bad as the justly intoned one that was 30 seconds or something like that. I forget what it was off the top of my head, but it was a whole number fraction, but it still sounded awful. So we have these pitches that exist between linear space, and they are more or less an attempt to line up overtones, and they roughly succeed. But what this enabled, abandoning the pursuit of perfection and kind of embracing the irrational and logarithmic nature of how we hear pitch, enabled a huge increase in complexity and the approachability of music. I can pick up my guitar and it is tuned to notes on these things, and I mean, even like explaining this, all of the frets on here, which when I push down on it will be as if I were pushing right here, holding down the string on a non-fretted instrument. These are all the same across all the strings, and you might also be able to notice that there is a kind of logarithmic-ish approach to the way that the frets are laid out, and it enabled this explosion in the complexity and and like approachability of music. I don't know.
Can you say around what time that happened?
I'm not sure exactly. I would say like the 18th century. In classical music and Western music in general, the most common tuning system since the 18th century has been 12-tone equal temperament. And that's what that's what this is here, is taking the circle, tempering out the comma that existed from Pythagorean tuning and from the other tunings, and then just dividing it up into 12 tones. There are a lot of other like ways in which you can divide this up. 31 is a popular one, and it's not that people would play each of these individual 31 steps. It's rather you, like with regular music, I said, you know, a lot of, and I'm going to touch on this next, but a lot of music will take your 12 keys on the piano and limit yourself to just 7 of them. And so rather than having 31 here, you might also pick out 7, but there's 7 that are suited for your purpose. And if I were to go back in here and, no, not equal temperament, just intonation, and look at this, you know, my sense ratio for 5/4 is 386.31. And so this is a pretty good amount less than 400, which is what the third notes are today. But if I come back here and I go to 31, I think it's 31, I find 387.10, which is really damn close. So if I find that and I go up to that again, it's somewhere up here. Wait, oh, no, this is 387. Here we go. And then I find 700. This is slightly sharp from 3/2. You know, you may or may not be able to hear the difference between that and the 12-tone version of the same thing. But for people who want to kind of push the edge of what you can do with music, this is a popular way of doing it. It allows you to keep the logarithmic nature that has made things practical and be a little bit more flexible. Now, you know, because if you're writing music in a computer and you're building your own synthesizer tools, you know, there's no reason for you to limit yourself to particular pitches. You can do just-in-time tonation. Aside from the fact that it just gets really complex. If you have, you know, if you start building this out to a particular degree and whatnot, you have a lot of these pitches that are kind of similar to each other. I've got 4 different variations of F sharp here. I've got 3 different variations of D. I've got 3 different variations of B flat. And then I've got, aside from my my fundamental, or tonic as we would call it in music theory, I've got, and my 4th and my 5th that are kind of isolated. Everything else has these parallels that are slightly off, and you can keep going with these. You know, I can keep adding notes around here, and you could do this in a computer that had some notion of gravity for where things are, and then just construct your nice perfect 5/4 and 3 seconds and whatever other kind of things that you wanted. But it just becomes really difficult to manage, and because most people are used to equal temperament and just want to get stuff done, a lot of our understanding for how to compose music or how to just put these things together is based around having 12 notes, of which you are using a subset primarily, and then just kind of living with the little bit of kind of off dissonance that happens. And this, this you might call it beating that happens, where things sound a little bit out of phase with each other. It's not as apparent on acoustic instruments. It's not as apparent that exists with the guitar. It's just that a saw wave is kind of a theoretically mathematically perfect way of generating a lot of overtones that adhere to an acoustic-like principle. The last thing that I've got an example for is kind of a way of thinking about this, and I hope it Here we go. What this does is this is a concept called a harmonic lattice, and it is at least here, what I wanted to do was talk about the notion of keys and chords and scales a little bit, and maybe use it to launch into a little bit of talking about melody. But when I lay this out, using the effectively the grid that I had before, where I have the fifth notes, which represent the third overtone, going up in one axis, and then I skewed this a little bit, but I have the fifth overtone, which represents, or the third notes, which represents the fifth overtone. And believe me, I got those mixed up a lot in my thinking about things, in my naming of variables. I got those mixed up a lot, and I found it easier to just stick with the common music terminology of the third and the fifth, rather than the third overtone and the fifth overtone. Going up in this particular way, I can draw another triangle going down and across in this particular way, where I have, this is this is the fifth overtone here. You might kind of ask yourself, well, okay, if this is the note that for which this represents the fifth overtone, and then this is the fifth, what is the relationship going over on and we're stacking these in a chord, as commonly happens. What would you call this relationship? And we call this a minor third in things. And so if this is then a major third and this is a minor third, and I can play the individual kind of relationships on here. Stacking these into three notes to become a particular chord, where it exists on a chord in the triangle here. This allows me to kind of look at the relationship between the chords in maybe a space that's a little bit more understandable. And this is where it starts to diverge from math and get more into what we're accustomed to, things that are maybe a little bit more cultural. There's where I'm going to go from here is less about math and more about kind of how our ears expect things, because as somebody who grew up in Western culture and listening to pop music and listening to classical music, these are things that I expect. And so this is more of a cultural aspect of music theory than it is a math one. I can think about these individual chords as having an occupation on this two-dimensional space, and this exists independently of where they actually are in the up or down range. I would have a very where I had some like 0.255 kind of buttons on the previous one for individual notes. That quickly gets out of hand with trying to do that on a grid like this, and this is why this sort of interface is not very common for playing chords. But it is a good way to understand how they relate to each other. And so I have, in this particular case, I've called it, the common terminology is using Roman numerals with uppercases for major chords, and the inverse, the one that uses this minor third as part of it, being a minor chord, uses a lowercase version of it, or a lowercase m, to indicate that it's minor. I can kind of navigate around this a little bit, and I might consider C major here to be home, and G major exists in that, and F major exists in that, A minor exists in that, E minor exists in that, E major exists in that. E minor doesn't really exist, and this is B minor, okay. B minor is kind of like off to the side a little bit, and then the further I get away from here, the further away from home I get. If I'm playing some chord, I start getting off into weird territory, and if I move around kind of randomly, might feel like I'm a little bit lost. So again, to underscore, music theory is not a here are the rules. It's more of an attempt to understand what works. But one of the things that you see a lot, especially modern pop music, I have a link in my README to the 4 Chord song by I think it's one of Jack White's projects. Really kind of fun to watch. But a lot of pop music exists on just 4 chords, and that is R1, R4, R minor 6, R5, and R1. And this little bit of shape is something that has a particular effect. It's very pleasing. And there's a lot of songs that you would probably recognize that fit into this particular bit of motion. But as a general rule, if you are trying to think about harmonic movement or moving around this space, sticking along the axis of fifths or moving where the chords share a blue line, particularly moving down, or moving, flipping across a particular line, or moving basically inside of moving along one of the thirds axis. I'm going to move down here. Kind of provides a way of reasoning about how these things relate to each other and how the overtone movement, how the overtones line up overall to produce a thing that we might expect, or that you might expect to be evoked from things, in the sense that, like, E represents the 5th overtone of C, then going from here to here has some basis in how the overtones relate to each other. Similarly, because the fifths are the strongest and the first ones that people actually notice, that is a very strong relationship. And you've probably heard the idea that, okay, well, you can play a punk song with just 3 chords, and those are these 3, the 1, the 4, and the 5. It is a very common thing especially in Western music, but just to have those 3 chords forming the backbone of a particular structure. And that's just because the way, well, I mean, actually, from here, these 3, F, A, C, C, E, G, and G, B, D, you have your 7 notes of a major scale. And similarly with C minor, C, G, E flat, C, F, A flat, and G, D, B flat, you have the 7 notes that form a minor scale, where those notes are just kind of like, here are the primary notes I'm going to use for my particular piece. These particular chords, I click this and it highlights these 3 don't light up. They're not the only chords, they're just kind of the common ones. There are what are called 7 chords as well, both major and minor. So, there's the one represented by 7 is typically called a dominant 7 chord, and that only really truly exists for these on the majors. So highlighting G, B, D, and then bringing in the 7th note, which in this particular case is F. This in G major, F is actually, well, wait, no. Right, no, F is in scale, but B to F is a very dissonant interval. This is that, let's see, I don't have it here, but it is that same kind of relationship in between F sharp and C. If I get these going again, we have our faux wolf interval. B and F have that same relationship. So if I bring that in, there's a lot of tension in this chord, and you might say that it's kind of like it's pointing at one particular place, and that is the fifth below. There's a lot of tension and then resolve through there. There are a couple of other ways of doing these. You can get into some jazzy territory. The minor chords, this isn't really a dominant seven. This is called a minor seven at that particular point. This resolution doesn't have the same weight. And then this brings back a different interval together. It doesn't sound very good to my ears. But it is a particular chord that exists in our space. There's a couple of others that are fun to know about. Stacking the fifths in this particular way produces what is called a suspended chord. These are used a lot of times when people want a sort of hollow feeling because they lack the third tonality. These are just, like I said, stacking the fifths. Similarly, you can stack major thirds. We call that an augmented chord. I don't like the way they sound. You can stack minor thirds, and you have a tritone in there along with a minor third that is already considered dissonant, and you get what's called a diminished chord. And you have a lot of the chords that are used as a basis for Western music today. That's what I have for examples. I wanted to talk a little bit more. I was going to go into, I think I covered a little bit here about scales and keys. If you take this particular relationship here between our flatted or sharped notes and extrapolate them, if you were to move them around with their particular relationships, you get something called modes, and this is something that came out. The individual modes are named after Greek islands, but the original meaning to them is lost to time, and they were really developed more through the church than anything else. If you were to take a piano keyboard and just have just the white keys and start on an individual white key and just count up until you get back to them, you will iterate through all the different modes. Going from C to D to E, F, G, A, B gives us what we call the major scale, and for the church modes, this was called not the Aeolian scale. This was, I forget it off the top of my head. It gives us one of our modes, but similarly, if you start with A and count up from A to B to C, where you have a minor third here, a minor for our third note, to D to D to E, and those are our fourth and our fifth, to G, which now is a minor third, like a minor relationship as well. Just as B flat D is flat to C, G is flat to A in that kind of relationship. And back to A. That is the basis of what we would call the minor scale today. The minor scale is often thought of as being a little bit more sad, and the major scale is thought of as being a little bit more happy. I prefer to think of them as the major scale being a little bit more consonant. That is, it has a little bit more resonant, a little bit more better resolution of the overtones with each other, whereas the minor scale is a little bit more dissonant. There are some other modes as well that have been used and are common in music. If you are like me and listen to a lot of surf rock or a lot of video game music, particularly things from the NES era, what's called the Dorian scale is used a lot, and this is starting with D and going around on the white keys again, going from D to E to F. D to F is a minor third. We have our going to D to G, we have a good, nice solid fourth. G to A, we have a good, nice solid fifth. But going from D to B rather than, it gives us where we have a minor third here, we have what we call major sixth note. It exists along this same axis that exists in the major scale. And then back to C as our seventh, but this is more of a minor seventh, as this might be between C and B, then say this C to B here. These can also produce a lot of other scales, things that are similar to scales that exist in other music. There's a mode called the Phrygian mode that starts with E that sounds very maybe Egyptian or whatnot. And one of the fun things about that is because it's going from E to F as the first step. That is, and it's not going to F sharp at all. It's not skipping up two like most of it does. That lends it a very weird feeling to it. I mean, I don't know. There is going with F and G produces some very bright sounding scales where instead of having you're augmenting the fourth note in starting with F with the Lydian mode, or you're diminishing something else, I think, with minoring something else with Mixolydian. And then I already talked about the minor scale. And then if you were to start on B, you get a very interesting sounding set of notes in that B and F, F is the fifth note up from B, and that sound is that wolf interval. It's very dissonant, and this is called the Locrian mode. It's not used harmonically very much, but it is used melodically. And this is actually how I like to think of modes is tools for melody. I'll talk about that in a minute, but the kind of funnish fact, the only pop song that I'm aware of that uses Locrian at its heart is Army of Me by Bjork. That has a very Locrian driven feeling, and it is also a very dark sounding song. She just never actually touches upon this fifth note. She dances around it, but she dances around it in the harmony, but does touch upon it very occasionally in the melody. And there's not a lot in there that is very interesting math-wise, and I kind of ran out of time for some of my examples, so I don't have particular other things to go into with that. Melody, I had some ideas around examples, but I ran out of time. Melody is effectively taking pitch and taking individual pitch and intersecting with rhythm to the point where you have a single note that you are or a single voice that you're sort of moving around. I would describe melody as the part of the song that you're humming. And for that particular case, there's not a lot that I can offer up in terms of mathematicalness of melody or melodic movement, except that a lot of these particular modes that exist, and one of the reasons why the church decided to kind of enshrine them as the way to create music from in the Middle Ages is that there are no steps that exist too far from each other. They produce there are 7 tones in here, and none of them are very far from each other. And as such, if you were to just take those 7 tones and just kind of do a drunk walk between any of them, up or down, the melodic space, which is in this case like C to D to E to F and then back, if you were to go up and around in a just random, I'm going to go up one, I'm going to go down one, or I'm going to stay here, and then just vary your time, you could have a melody generator. I've noticed tendencies in melodies that you tend to end a little bit of a phrase on either home or on the fifth, even though that while these are the closest possible, this is the closest possible relationship in harmonic space, it is the farthest distance in melodic space. Jumping from one to the other just feels very off when you're doing a melody, even though there are examples of it. I sing "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" to my kid a lot, and that initial "twinkle twinkle twinkle twinkle" is a fifth, but it is a kind of a big jump, and it feels big. Whereas if I were to go just up an entire octave, "twinkle twinkle," that doesn't necessarily feel like as big of a leap, even though the pitch is going by quite as much. And that's kind of what I have for you in terms of trying to lay out some of the ideas behind how music works from a mathematical perspective. I'm happy to take some questions. I'm not an expert in this stuff by any stretch of the imagination. If you've got questions about my code, I might be able to answer them. But that's what I've got.
That's fantastic. You got into some Wheel of Fifths stuff that I haven't looked at since guitar lessons in high school.
I mean,
that was awesome.
I had heard about the circle of fifths probably 20 years ago, and it wasn't until I understood the ratio aspect of the pitch and the overtone aspect of it that it really clicked for me. It wasn't for me, at least. It wasn't until I understood this basic part of the physics of sound and this basic math aspect of it that it really was like, oh, okay, that makes sense now. And it's the same thing with the fifth overtone representing the third note, and why that sounds like harmonious to us, where it's like, oh, this is just ratios. This is all just ratios. The thing that kind of originally spawned this for me was just the idea that I have a link in here about this, but there's this myth that like the Greeks and Pythagoras in particular hated irrational numbers, and this link is to an actual historian, a classic Hellenist, who is debunking that notion. But the square root of 2, which you can very easily get to from the Pythagorean theorem, is an irrational number and forms our halfway point in this kind of place in an octave. And it is also something that is less less wolf interval than you would get from the things that you arrived at by using whole numbers. And that something about that pursuit of this theoretical perfection by chasing whole numbers, and then also enabling by abandoning that for and embracing the logarithmic nature of this, and by embracing the irrational numbers for it, which allowed for creating this explosion of complexity and approachability of music, and just embracing that imperfection. Just like it felt like a lot of parallel for me with programming or some of the other endeavors that I've had, where it's like, okay, well, it's good enough. And I don't know, this is at least the tuning system thing is something that I've been chewing on as a topic for probably a decade plus now.
It's cool stuff. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording because questions come out after that. Go ahead, Chris.
So I was using an app the other day, just a couple days ago, and if it records bird sounds. So if you don't know what kind of bird it is, you kind of hit record, and then it will play it, and then we'll submit it to a web service, and then we'll try to identify the bird It was a squirrel that I was looking at, so it just said it couldn't figure it out. But it was cool. The spectra, the spectrum graph that you showed, it was a similar one to that.
And this is not this one, but this is a very common way of showing sound.
That bottom part.
Pretty much any tool that you're going to have for analyzing sound is going to involve something like this, just because it is a great way of looking at something and kind of reasoning about it a little bit.
Picking out all the frequencies at the same time.
Yeah. There is the guy who created Kai's Power Tools, if you remember that Photoshop plugin from the 90s, actually created a additive synthesizer where you would draw pictures like this, and then it would make a sound from them. And he did that back in the 90s. It's a program called Metasynth, and it still exists today. I think it's a Mac only program. But the if I don't know if anybody here is familiar with say Aphex Twin, who is an electronic musician. He's kind of I might say like the petulant child, at least, of it initially, where he just went into a lot of different genres. There is the second track on his Window Licker EP actually has a picture of his face that was put into Metasynth and then rendered into an image, or rendered into sound. And I don't know, people use these technologies for all sorts of fun things.
Have you considered adding color to some of the graphics, like on the hue, saturation, luminosity scale?
I totally considered that. I just I probably spent about 20 hours putting this together already, and just as somebody who is an interface designer and has designed data visualizations for like dashboarding type situations where people need to grok something at a whim, my default is also just to stick to black and white as much as possible, because color is hard. Not like it's not so much that color is hard because it would be hard to put color into that, but because you start getting between color blindness and luminosity values and all sorts of other things, you start getting into really tricky territory very quickly. And that is another thing I could give a talk about. I could easily spend an hour or two just talking about color theory. It's for a while. I have a few white whales as a programmer. Like my own little Moby Dick that I was chasing for a long time, and one of those is color theory and trying to produce a spreadsheet for colors and creating colors that work well together with them. It is a problem that is, at least in terms of difficulty, up on the scale with producing content management systems.
I always thought it was interesting in Newton's optics. He originally intended to have a mapping of hue to notes. It's not a perfect mapping, but it's interesting that he made that analogy.
There's I don't know what you'd call it, a phenomena that some people are affected by called synesthesia, where their senses kind of blend into each other. Back to Bjork, apparently she is somebody who has this. She's been known to describe sounds to her engineers as I want it to sound more like toothpaste coming out of a toothpaste tube. I have no idea what that is. I get a visual before I get a sound. That's something that exists quite a bit. I don't know. I have a visual arts background, and I think about color palettes actually in a kind of a tonal chord-like manner, at least just in terms of how, say, greens and purples can kind of resonate with each other in a particular way.
The other,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing is, did you take a look at Tone.js kind of a
Maybe
wrapper?
I didn't. There's a lot of different things, and for me, it was just more like, okay, I looked at the web. I proposed this talk. I forget back in like May or June or something, and I wrote up a description where I said I was going to be using web audio APIs, even though I've never actually used them. And I came up with my rough outline about what I wanted to do, and it's like, okay, well, I can schedule samples, I can do analysis, and I can synthesize sine and sawtooth waves. Boom, that's all I need. And just thinking about this and thinking about like, okay, this is like going to exist in a web browser, and it's not about creating those sounds. The physics of sound and sound design, there's also still a lot of math in that, perhaps even more so. And that is something that like I could kind of touch on in an hour and a half, 2 hours, but it would take a lot longer to really go into any kind of real depth. But like just for my particular thing here, it was more, I need some visualizations, I need some buttons, I need to be able to draw a graph, and that's all stuff I know how to do. And interacting with the web audio API by itself is not that hard. Really, the challenge was just how to propagate changes from my little React app over to the web audio API.
Okay, yeah, I see. You wanted to have the math be apparent, but
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. It's more just like I didn't want to mess around with something. Like I didn't want to mess around with something that maybe wasn't the best suited for what I was doing. And I am a person who will do SVG by hand, just kind of as default, because it's oftentimes a lot easier for me to get the bar chart or whatever chart that's in my head by doing SVG than it is to wrestle with some library's notion of how a chart's supposed to be rendered.
SVG by hand is great, though. I just did that last week and I was like, that's it? That's
Yeah,
all?
it's not hard at all.
So good. I really enjoyed seeing some of these visualizations kind of put it in a way I'd never clicked before. The spectrum sweeping across the bottom of the screen, especially in the going all the way around the circle, like seeing the things getting added to the circle as you go. Like I had seen the circle before, but
Yeah,
seeing the things show up at like in particular was kind of eye opening.
my goal with that was kind of to like try to derive this from first principle, and then at the same time give historical context around it as well. I mean, the fact that like these are physical things that people are interacting with and have like limitations as such. This is my ukulele, and as I use it, as I pluck on this string, it will gradually loosen and loosen, and then I have to retune it. And that is a limitation. The fact that there are justly intoned guitars with fretboards that you look at it and it's like, oh my god, that's wild. And there are all these other kind of um, like weird things that people have done to to use these other alternate tuning systems or whatnot today that seem like, oh my god, why on earth would you do that? But it's like, oh, this is interesting to me, so I'm going to pursue it. And if this is like, if music is totally your thing and you get really into a particular kind of way of thinking about pitch or harmony, then sure, you're going to create your own tools, or you're going to really learn some of your other tools. Like I personally hate the piano. I don't like the way that pitches are laid out on it. It's never gelled with me very well. I have one. It came with my house. And like I'm teaching my kid how to play it, but it's not something that I really like grok or even want to grok on a particular way. But what I have for playing synthesizers with instead is this thing, which is called Linstrument. It was created by Roger Lin, who got famous for creating synthesizers in the early days of those. And what this does is it provides me with a pitch grid that works actually very similar to the frets on a guitar. And I decided to invest in that both in terms of money and time, because it just gels with my way of thinking and how I want to do things. And like as such, my guitar is not tuned the same way that a standard guitar is tuned. A standard guitar is tuned to E, A, D, G, B, E, where the difference between most of those strings is a fourth note, but going from G to B between that fourth string and the fifth string is a third. And so the chords that work on the top strings don't work on the bottom strings and vice versa. They're different hand positions. So I just tune my guitar to E, A, D, G, C, F, which is all fourths. And I can, if I want a 3-fingered chord or whatnot, I can actually use the same hand shapes that I'm using on this thing and plonk it down anywhere and it's going to sound the same. But for my way of thinking about the stuff, that's more appropriate.
Have you seen the hexagonal piano keyboards,
Yeah,
like the Janko and the Jammer? Because it seems like it has that same.
They are
Yeah, but
fucking expensive.
You can move your hand, and the same finger shape produces the same.
I used to have
intervals,
something called something called a Snyderphonics Manta, which is a metal plate about this big with hexagons etched into it, and the individual hexagons are pressure sensitive or capacitive. So based on how much of your skin touches the pad, and it required an intermediate app. It didn't send MIDI information that most other things could read. It required an interpretive device, and one of the things that the Linstrument does that the Manta did not is being able to slide between pitches. I can pick this up, and for a particular row, I can go from one point to the next, and the synthesizer will keep up with me. It will follow my finger movement and interpret that as vibrato, which is like the same technique that a violinist might use by moving their finger back and forth while they're also bowing something to alter the pitch of the note. It allows that extra expressivity, and that was just not possible on the Manta. And the Janko and whatnot, you also don't get that. And so the Janko is like, last I looked, it costs more than this thing did, and it's like, okay. I still have my hand shapes. I've been kind of compiling them into. Let's see. I've been giving myself, as somebody who attempts to illustrate concepts for a living, and particularly for illustrating certain ideas, one of the things that I created for myself on here was a reference for chord shapes on the Linstrument, or really kind of any fourth spaced grid. And so this is like a kind of way of taking all these different chords and different articulations of the chords that you can have and just giving myself a reference. And that's a really nice thing to have, but I think it's a little bit more difficult to do that on a hexagon grid.
So by default, I think most current versions of browsers suppress the audio context by default. Did you have something in your implementation such that when you clicked an element, it would initialize the context? Or
it initializes the context on PageWood. You have to grab it. I mean, I'm using Firefox here. I didn't test this in Chrome. I didn't test this in Safari. I didn't test this in Edge. It's just like, this is some shit I put together for a talk, and it's the quality reflects that. It worked in Firefox, and that was all we needed it to do.
Okay, yeah, I've kind of noticed each browser has its own weirdness with the audio context, but yeah.
I was actually really impressed with the audio context API. You can do a lot with it. You can do convolution reverb, which is a way of recording the effectively like what they call an impulse response for a particular place. Typically, you would take like a clap or a starter gun, something that produces a loud kind of bang with frequencies across the entire frequency spectrum, and then you record how the space responds to that sound, how it diffuses over time. And then based off of that recording, you can use convolution to make any other sound as if it were in that space based off of your impulse response. So there's like since this technology became popular, there's been a bumper crop of people going around recording impulse responses for cathedrals or under bridges, or like a vacuum hose, or I've had fun doing it in like stairwells for office buildings I've worked in, or whatnot. You can also use them to simulate amplifiers as well, because those modify the sound somewhat. They don't necessarily add harmonics to, but they do reduce the harmonics. So I actually, like a plugin developer that for audio plugins that I respect a lot, just recently put out a plugin called Lo-Fi as Fuck, which uses impulse responses of like telephone receivers and other things like that to make your sound more vintage. There's one for a Soviet wire recorder, and all sorts of things like that. And it's a neat technology, and you can do it in JavaScript. I was really impressed by the breadth of the API. I didn't think that it would get so. I've seen some of the things people can do with it, but I hadn't really looked at it seriously before, and it's impressive. You can do some really like amazing things in it.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that the precise timing in the audio API isn't used for tasks other than music. Like potentially you could use it to have more fine control over animation. Like request animation frame isn't really a great interface.
There are reasons for that, and I mean I think it kind of comes down to like the scheduling with the audio context. Like the work that is going to be done is finite. You're not saying run this code at this time. Whereas request animation frame is, okay, next time you're willing to let me draw something, let me run some code. The atomizer thing that I built actually, like, it uses that to just continuously draw the spectrogram and draw the time series diagram. It uses request animation frame to do that, but like, request animation frame, and then it runs some code. And to make that more performant, like I allocated some arrays beforehand, and I allocated some variables beforehand, so it would try to make things easier on the browser. It would be really easy to have a memory leak through that if you weren't careful. But like that, you are like saying, okay, next time you can, let me run some code.
Yeah, that's actually one of the nice things about Tone.js. They actually have a facility to more tightly connect to the audio context. What happens in the audio context trigger an animation frame draw.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at it. I have when I do my stuff, I have other tools, a lot of which aren't even in the computer. Like I've got this whole collection of guitar pedals over here on little shelves, kind of resembling a modular synthesizer, and then a patch bay in the back with wires, and like it's kind of fun having actual knobs and wires that you can kind of plug and replug in, and it's a nice workflow for me. But in terms of these particular things, it's also like choosing them as tools for specific purposes, and then also not wanting to care too much about how they work internally, but rather just liking what they do.
Well, thanks for the nice talk. I suppose the recording will find its way somewhere.
Yeah, the previous two talks I've given during pandemic times I've gotten up on YouTube, so they're linked from my website. which is linked from my GitHub, and I think I posted the GitHub link in Slack. Yeah.
Cool. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.